Hey guys, I know it's been a while since I've last uploaded my video, so I'm really sorry for that because the last time I uploaded a video, it was my last few weeks in Indonesia, so I kind of want to spend it with family and friends instead of the computer. And I kind of want to talk about my last video. I feel that I didn't do it justice as much as I would like because I had to skimp out a lot of history because the history of the tomato is so in-depth that I fear if I were to really talk about it, the video would just linger on and it'll be way too long. And I fear that for future videos that do contain tomato as well, that I might run into a similar conundrum. So I thought, hey, since a lot of dishes do have tomatoes, and the tomato history itself is such a unique history, I might as well dedicate a segment where we talk about the core ingredients of many different meals so that we don't have to repeat them over and over again. Got it? Alright, so with that being said, this segment will be called Historeat 101 because we'll be introducing all of the core ingredients of many future meals that we'll talk about later. And let us introduce probably one of the most important ingredients in modern cooking, and that is the tomato. So it's probably fair to assume that a lot of you probably think, hey, probably the tomatoes from Italy, right? You know, pasta, pizza sauce, lasagna, like tomato is just there. And I'm not gonna lie, like if I think of tomato, the first thing that comes into my mind is Italy, but it's not Italian, nor is it even from Europe. It actually came all the way from South America, particularly within the Andes mountain, because if you actually go there right now, you can find wild tomatoes there growing. And of course, as with many crops that are grown naturally, people will find a way to cultivate them agriculturally, and that this method also traveled all the way up Mexico around 500 BC. But why is this important? It is because within the land of Mexico, one particular empire known as the Aztecs coined the modern term tomato. In the Nahuatl language, tomato is known as tomatl, which basically means a rounded and bulgy thing or a bloated fruit. And when the Spaniards arrived, they adopted the word tomatl within the Spanish language in 1532, and this word is tomate. And to give a brief explanation as to how the Spaniards arrived in Mexico, well, basically the Spanish Empire did expand to almost all of South America, as well as all of Central America and parts of North America. And since Mexico is part of Central America, it is a Spanish domain. One man known as Hernan Cortes was directly responsible for the conquest and the incorporation of Mexico into the Mexican Empire. And it is believed that Hernan Cortes, or at least the Spanish government, shipped the tomato back to Spain around 1540, particularly in Sevilla, because back then that was the trading hub of the old world. And unfortunately, the Spaniards sort of generalized the word tomatl because within the Nahuatl language, the tomato is divided into two different parts. The tomato that we know today is actually specifically known as the xitomatl, which means a plump fruit with a round navel. And the other one is called the miltomatl, a small and round fruit. Or in today's Spanish, it's known as the tomatillo. And in case you don't know what the tomatillo is, it's basically the core ingredient for most of Mexican salsa. So you might be thinking, hey, this is probably one of the only few misconceptions the Spaniards have regarding the tomato. Unfortunately, it is the least consequential misconception that the Spaniards have, because even though I know today that the tomato is such a popular fruit, and yes, it's a fruit, not a vegetable, and I'll elaborate that more a bit why most of us think it's a vegetable, but unfortunately, in the past, the tomato was seen as a poisonous fruit. The reason why is that the tomato plant heavily resembles belladonna, which is a very toxic plant native to Europe. And it also doesn't help that the tomato and the belladonna are actually from the same botanical family of the nightshade, or specifically the Solanum family. I think that's the right name, I'll let you know properly. And if we're gonna be very technical with botanical terms, the botanical name of the tomato is Solanum lycopersicum, which means nightshade wolf peach. So you have an idea that the tomato was not really looked on in a positive light, unfortunately. And fun fact, the tomato, the potato, the eggplant, a bunch of peppers, and a lot of other plants are from the same family of nightshade, which is why the potato was also seen as poisonous at the time, as well as eggplants. And now you might be thinking, gee, is there any scientific reason as to why people thought it was poisonous instead of like, oh, it looks like a poisonous plant, be careful? Actually, there is, but first let's talk to the less scientific of the proofs that they believed back then. Tomato is basically relatively high in acidity, which is why if you bite it raw, it's kind of relatively sour. And at the time, the plates back then were made out of pewter, and it is believed that the high acidity of the tomato will bring out the lead that pewter contains, which will lead to lead poisoning. Shocker, ooh, ancient medieval sciences. But the more scientific reason as to why the tomato is actually harmful is because tomato actually contains tomatin, and in high dosage and depending on the individual, it can be potentially deadly. But you can only find high dosage of tomatin when the tomato is not ripe. And even then, it wouldn't really hurt you if you are a perfectly healthy human being. But never ever feed tomatoes to your dogs because this can cause them to be really sick and potentially even dead. And if you have an autoimmune disorder yourself, you should also try to avoid tomatoes because it can cause inflammation and it won't be pretty. Okay, so that sort of covers the scientific explanation as to why people thought were poisonous. Now I want to talk about who first wrote down about the tomato, and it is believed that the first written account of the tomato in Europe is by Pietro Andrea Mattioli, and he is sort of known as the father of botany in Italy. In 1555, he had this to say about the tomato. The tomatoes were flattened like Melrose apples and cut into wedges. First they were green, and then when they matured, some were red like blood and some were gold. And it is because of Mattioli's description that the tomatoes, which look like apple, was actually gold. He coined the term pomi di oro, which in Italian means golden apples. And if you've noticed by now, this is the direct predecessor to the modern Italian word of tomato, which is pomodoro. And he also noted in his book that the tomato is actually consumed in Italy as they would consume eggplants, which is fried in oil and seasoned with salt and pepper. And this would arguably make Italy one of the first nations to widely consume the tomato, at least relatively wider than their other European counterparts, because the tomato first arrived in Europe arguably in 1540 and this book was published in 1555. But arguably the first written recipe that includes the tomato was the recipe of Antonio Latini's Lo Scalco alla Modena, and he basically called for the tomato to be prepared in a stew, mixed with eggplants as well as courgettes. And he also has a recipe that would call for the creation of a Spanish-style sauce, because in Spain they would often make the tomato in forms of sauce or they were to eat them raw. And as we're talking about names, the French used to think that the tomato is an aphrodisiac, which is why they coined the term for the tomato as pomme d'amour, or love apples. And coincidentally, this is why in the Neapolitan language, the word for tomato is not pomodoro as it is in Italian, but it is di pomaroli, which is derived from the French pomme d'amour, because the French did have strong influence within Naples. So, because of all this, unfortunately the tomato was relegated to the purpose of decor, because many people were still too scared to eat them. But as with many things in life, perceptions will change, economic crises will have forced them to consider, and of course, many other reasons why. But I want to give one interesting story. The tomato arrived in America, ironically not from Mexico, but actually from Europe, even though Mexico is literally down under America. So think of it, the tomato had to cross all the way from the Atlantic Ocean to Europe, and then all the way back from the Atlantic Ocean into America. So globalization right there. And like in Europe when the tomato first arrived, the Americans initially were reluctant and hesitant to try the tomato. So in 1820, Robert Gibbon Johnson, he kind of wanted to test the myth that tomatoes were harmful. So he basically stood in front of the Salem courthouse and ate tomatoes in front of the crowd. And at that point, it was still really believed that the tomato was poisonous. It's like if you were to see somebody eat rat poison in front, and yet he would survive. And that's how in America, tomatoes slowly shifted from being a poisonous decorative plant into a consumable good. And speaking of America, it is arguable that it is because of America that most people think of the tomato as a vegetable instead of a fruit, because in America back then, fruits were taxed, but vegetables were not, which is why many people try to label the tomato as a vegetable. Just fun fact. And I know that this video might seem Eurocentric, and for that I apologize, but it's because there are just too much information about the tomato that I would not be able to cover them properly, which is why I thought it would be best to just talk about the European perspective, as this is how most nations are introduced to the tomato. But I want to know your perspective from your culture and your country. How did the tomato come there? And how popular is the tomato in your country? And what dishes heavily use tomato? Well, I hope you enjoyed this brief history of the tomato and its history around the world. And I hope this has given you a greater appreciation as to where your food originated from. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.